Welcome to Insanity Fair. This is part 2 of my video series about competitive consumerism. So if you've just stumbled across this, I'd encourage you to go back to look at the introduction and part 1. Now, in part 1 I suggested that there was an instinctive basis for the urge to consume competitively, namely the instinctive desire to gain status in society. So today I'd like to consider the effect of this on society. And to do that, I'd like to look at some examples of the behaviour of women in some countries that I've lived in. So, to start with, here I am in rural France, and I'd like to think about women's clothes, the way that women dress. Now, we're going to leave out young women, because I think there's another aspect to this, which is sexual display. And young women everywhere have, like young men, have a need to display themselves as being sexually attractive, possibly even sexually available, which is a different thing. So I'm talking more about married women, adult women, let's say, at a random point, let's say women over about 30, 35. Now, here, as in, I think the whole of southern Europe, let's say, the Latin countries and Greece, adult women didn't have fashion, you see, until fairly recently. And they used to wear a style of clothing which you still see here among old ladies who come out from their houses in the country. And it's a sort of uniform. It's a sort of floral print. I don't know what you'd call it. It's just a sort of shapeless dress. And it's completely practical. They might wear a scarf on their head. And they wear the same thing every day, or some small variation of it. And you see these clothes on sale in the markets. They used to be simple cotton prints. Now they're likely to be synthetic because they'll last longer. And there are racks and racks of them. There are some variations in colour, but they're all basically the same. Now, if we look at their daughters, really the next generation, most of them are employed, and a lot of them, this being France, are employed by the state, which is the largest employer. It employs about half the workforce. And the women who work for the state are probably in administrative positions. Some of them will be doing something more practical. They'll be home helps. They might be assistants in primary schools. They might look after children in the creche. I'm talking about the uneducated people in the countryside and in small provincial towns. Now, they dress in a completely different manner because they have disposable income, and one of the first things that they spend money on is clothes. And in fact, there are sort of special shops for these women where they can buy clothes which demonstrate their status. They don't really have any other function. They often have all sorts of peculiar things hanging off them, sort of a big fold or something, which doesn't serve any purpose except to show that you have spent more money on your clothes and that they're made out of some sort of fancy fabric or something. And you'll see whole groups of women, say going out to lunch or something like that, and they're all wearing these peculiar clothes. And so the only function of these clothes is to win status. And they obviously pay great care to them. Also to the accessories, shoes, of course, you can spend almost any amount of money on shoes, handbags, all these sort of little extra things. And because you're taking them to work where they're going to be examined minutely by all the other women who are doing the same thing, then you're paying a lot of attention to it, and it becomes a very important part of you, and so you've accepted the principle of competitive consumption, and it's something that your mother, let's say your grandmother, certainly didn't have, just didn't know anything about. And it's not something that you've decided to do, it's not something that you've thought about particularly, but even so, there it is. You've become a competitive consumer. Now, I think it may be that women have a different principle at work, actually, because there is this group mentality, and I'd like to illustrate that with somewhere else that I lived, a small village in Greece, which was emerging from what would you call it, a pre-literate way of life, actually. For hundreds of years in Greece, the only person who could read and write in the village would be the priest. This was under Turkish domination, actually, originally. And so in our village, often the parents couldn't read and write, but the children could, because they'd introduced education. And so the adult women were sort of on the cusp of this, and they would compete in a different way. They had the same thing as I've just described in the older generation in France. They wore clothes, but they didn't have fashion. They all went to the same two shops in the village to buy their clothes, so there wasn't much choice. And they all wore the same rather severe clothes. But what they did was to clean for status. Anybody who's lived in Greece will know what I'm talking about. The women just clean endlessly. And it's not competitive in the same way, because everybody has to do it all the time. So it's as if you have to do it to keep up. It's sort of compulsory. And the women would scrub the outsides of their houses. It's the only time I've ever seen this. And they would do it in an ostentatious way to show people what they were doing. And that leads me to the third example, which is Italy, where there's the same sort of transition from peasants to employed people. Although there's an additional thing in Italy, which is that the when people made that transition, what they did was to gravitate towards cities. And so Rome, for example, where I lived, in the 1920s I've seen photographs of Rome, and there were sheep in the streets in the Piazza del Popolo. It was a much, much smaller city, and then it suddenly became huge because of the arrival of all of these peasants, or the children of peasants, coming from a very long way away, from southern Italy sometimes, and from the surrounding area in Lazio, and creating this huge suburban area of high-rise concrete blocks. And they kept one tradition which you see throughout Italy, actually, which is rather nice, which is and in Spain also, which is going out in the evening and walking up and down, parading up and down. You'll see this in provincial towns as well, large villages, people getting dressed up and walking up and down. Now, in Rome, in the suburbs of Rome, you had to have a fur coat. Women had to have fur coats to do this. And if they didn't have a fur coat, they wouldn't go out. Someone explained to me. They would rather stay at home, because if you came out and you didn't have a fur coat, you had a cloth coat, or you had no coat, then you would lose face. You'd lose what the Italians call figura, che figura, and you would be ashamed, and people would talk about you and joke about you and point at you, because people can be cruel. And this has two aspects which I think are interesting. One is that fur is actually a very ancient sign of status. And in the Middle Ages it used to be the case that different ranks of society were allowed to wear different kinds of fur. And we still see some traces of this. For example, in England, in the House of Lords, the Lords have robes with fur ermine on the fur, and I think the crown jewels, I think they have fur on the crown as well, and so there are particular kinds of fur which conferred status on people of a particular kind. And so the Italian women wearing their fur coats, it's the same thing, because they can tell, the poorest people will wear coats made of rabbit, I suppose, and then there will be a whole gradation up, which you can see, because you can see with fur what kind of fur it is, up to, I don't know, blue mink or whatever the most expensive kind of fur coat is. It's a much bigger commitment than the French women going out and buying their peculiar shapeless status markers, because buying a fur coat, it's like buying a car approximately. It's a serious investment, and so people go into debt. They have special schemes for buying fur coats, and obviously a woman will want to have the most expensive, most beautiful, highest status coat that she can possibly afford. And so that means it's become just a question of money. It's no longer a mark of, your social rank. It's purely a question of money, I saw Sylvester Stallone's mother once in the street in Rome, surrounded by photographers, and she was wearing the most incredible fur coat. I don't know what it was, but it looked like $1 million, as they say, and that's probably what it was. But what I think this illustrates, or the point I'd like to draw from this, is that as with the Greek women cleaning their houses in view of each other, it becomes compulsory. Now that doesn't mean that there's a law saying all Italian women have to buy a fur coat. Of course not. And there are, of course, also plenty of Italian women who don't do this. You know, more educated women, for example, and, you know, left-wing people, hippie types, all kinds of people don't do this, but still, for the mass of conformist people, it's compulsory. There's no choice. And so I think that is something that is repeated throughout society. First of all, you start with some aspect of behaviour. Wearing clothes. Everybody has to wear clothes. Then it's turned into something, it's commercialised, and so the acquisition of status becomes competitive in a new way, and in the end it becomes simply a question of competing through spending more money on essentially the same thing. So that's the point I'd like to establish for today. Thank you.